Hi everyone, I'm Jen Mason from the Colorado Snow Sports Museum, and we are here for our snowboard. We're so excited for our snowboard edition of our Through the Lens programming series, and we have longstanding board member Trent Bush with us today, and he is the curator of the entire snowboard exhibit, The Roots of a Movement. So we are here today to learn all about the amazing artifacts in this collection that we have in the museum. And then Trent also bought from Denver, from our resource center, some really cool and interesting things that are not on display. So please, if you are a snowboard enthusiast, make sure you watch this and stick around, because there are some artifacts that you will see today that you won't normally see when you come into the museum. So in a normal world, we normally do these, and they're really cool and they're fun, and we do them inside the museum, and we have beer and wine and cheese and crackers and all sorts of, and hugs for everybody. But obviously we can't meet in person right now. So if you learn something, if you're inspired by this program, please consider making a $25 donation. You can just use your phone and use the QR code, and it'll pop right up and it'll go right to our donation page. And also, if you're ever in Vail, please make sure you visit the museum. We are open 11 to 6 daily, and you can come visit these amazing artifacts and see our entire collection of not just snowboarding, but obviously all of the other, there's a bunch of skiing things. We have a skiing through time exhibit. We also have the coolest ski fashion exhibit that I've seen in a long time. So now I'd like to introduce Trent Bush, and he is going to walk us through this entire exhibit that he curated himself.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, thank you for coming. Welcome. Kind of what we wanted to do tonight, as Jen said, is walk through the exhibit, because obviously if you don't actually come in, we don't have a lot of ways for you to see it right now, so we really wanted to do an in-depth presentation, talking through the timeline, talking through sort of a North America perspective of snowboarding and where it really came from. And we will also be keying in specifically on Colorado throughout the walk and talk. And as Jen said, please, if you feel you learned something or you like to support the mission, please definitely donate and help us continue doing the great work up here. Right, so we kind of open the exhibit with just a little bit of an overall background, and we also talk about some of the icons of snowboarding, who you'll see as we kind of talk through the exhibit. And again, we call it Roots of a Movement because really, it's the sort of kernels of ideas that people came up with, and especially sort of that do-it-yourself, DIY mentality that is really a big part of what snowboarding has started from and remains to today. I do want to thank, obviously, Susie Josem, who was the executive director prior to Jen, because she was the one that really gave me the green light to come in and bring some friends and really try to put together something that was really special. I really have to thank David Alden and Curto Lessick, who were invaluable and remain invaluable in helping us pull all this together. The important thing here, you'll see a lot of really cool snowboards. Their meaning is a little deeper because these are the snowboards from the creators. When we show the boards, I'll mention it again, but these are, Jake Burton's personal boards he made. These are Tom Sims' boards he made by hand. Stevie Dara, there are all kinds of people in this museum that are represented, and these are their personal snowboards, so they're really the most meaningful probably in any collection on the planet right now. So really cool, and it's really good to come up and see them in person. I think to start, we'll kind of talk about snowboarding and sort of the real roots that maybe didn't go somewhere, but people have been trying to stand sideways on snow for a long time, much longer than a lot of people actually think. The earliest known sort of snowboards it's called Lazboarding. It was in Turkey. In over 400 years they've been riding snowboards, and it's a really, really interesting way of riding a snowboard, and it's actually pretty much like the first earliest snowboards that are actually known in the United States, which we can talk about now. The earliest known records of snowboards go back to the early 1900s, 1917 or so. There's a person named Vern Wickland who actually was trying to create a substitute for skis, and really started that around 1917. Like I said, this is one of his earliest prototypes. And again, there's probably only one of these in the world. So we're really lucky to be able to have this on loan right now from the Bergeson family, who I'll talk about right now. The Bunker Company, which is this snowboard right here, really interesting. Made in the 1930s. It was actually called the Snowsurf, and it was made to put one foot in the rear and hold onto the rope, and then you actually used a drag stick to drag behind you. This board is actually really controversial because it just showed up one year in the Burton booth at SIA at the ski and snowboard show, and controversial because it was just nobody had heard of it, and it was just too good. There was footage, there were Super 8 film, that just looked, they were pristine condition, and so people were thinking that maybe there was something maybe not totally legit about it. We were able to do all of the research, track down not just the Wickland side of the family, which is sort of, it's also known as the Wickland board, but I was able to speak to Don Bergeson, who is a descendant of Harvey and Gunnar Bergeson, who were brothers in Chicago. And so they tried to create a alternative to skiing with the Snowsurf, which is just an incredible story. The other way that we know, besides the footage and knowing that it's the brothers, as you can see actually from this photo right here, these are the brothers in the video and the footage, but also if you look at the patent, which they actually filed in was actually awarded in 1939, this patent was actually referenced on the Snurfer patent that we'll talk to later. So you can go to the patent office, you can find this. It's called a sled there, but it describes how you stand up and how you put your foot under the strap. So it's a really, really amazing artifact, and we're really lucky to have that here. So please come up and take a look at that. So again, snowboarding's much older and started earlier than most people think. When we start to kind of move into the modern era, there's really a gap, because this board, while they made these boards, they went to trade shows. We actually have on display a rejection letter from Wilson Sporting Goods, where they rejected the idea in 1939. Then World War II happened, and so there wasn't a whole lot. And so there's a lot of gray area of what happened in the early time between the 40s and really into the 60s. And so that's when snowboarding really kind of came back in a different way. If you walk this way, we have on display snowboard that Tom Sims made in 1965. But this is actually the first snowboard he ever made, which was in 1963. He made this in his junior high woodshop class. This is, if you remember, there was a Mazda TV commercial a few years back. This is the one that was sort of featured. So obviously very crude, rudimentary board. But again, Tom's passion, growing up in New Jersey, to actually sort of surf on snow and skateboard on snow. This is where those roots come from. For a long time, we all thought that Tom's board in 1963 was actually the earliest known modern era snowboard. So we've actually found magazine articles. This is from 1964. But we actually tracked down a guy named Steve Nelson, who grew up in Southern California, surfer. And he actually won a design contest for Alcoa Aluminum in 1961, creating his snow surfer, which again was really, really early. No rope, stand up. You started, as he explained it to me, like a surfboard on your knees, and you pop up and you ride the thing. And so he was actually riding this just outside Bear Mountain, California, in the early 60s. So, the really interesting thing about snowboarding, it's recent enough that we know most of the history, but it's just old enough that a lot of this stuff can be dug out and really, we really have to find it from just the sort of passion and any little clue, and we can actually track a lot of that down. So really interesting stuff. That doesn't take away anything, of course, from Tom Sims and his legacy, because what happened with Tom, with his 6 degrees of Tom Sims, and we'll kind of realize that as we go through the presentation. Tom was absolutely a pioneer in so many ways, and actually took that sort of early stoke that he had for snowboarding and really moved that out toward, through people that he knew, through his college roommate, through a guy named Steve Link, who he used to babysit. And we'll talk through that as it comes along, but you'll start to get a sense of how important some of these pivotal figures, Tom Sims, Jake Burton, those kinds of guys are throughout the history of snowboarding. And just going back to this snowboard real quick, Tom's board from 1965, because I kind of blushed over it. This is the earliest example that we have of anybody really trying to secure your feet to a board. So he used inner tubes from bike tires. He used the carpet on top, and then you can actually see he kind of carved the signature Sims name in the side with just with the tip of some sort of sharp object. And then if you look on the bottom, there's actually aluminum and metal that he kind of nailed on there to try to make it slide better in the snow. So absolute pioneer. And we also have a number of boards in the collection that are from sort of those people that Tom inspired back in the day, including his college roommate and a few other people who Tom he was so passionate, and for a lot of us, he was the guy that really got us excited about snowboarding in the earliest days. And that sort of mentality he had towards snowboarding, just that stoke he had for it, really influenced so many people as we move along. As we talked about, there's sort of this desire, obviously, standing sideways on snow, starting early. It started in powder. You couldn't ride snowboards at ski areas. You didn't have edges. You didn't have all kinds of things. And so there was skateboarding, surfing, those things really led to snowboarding more so than just the pure ski side of things, because people weren't doing it at ski areas, and they were really trying to get that same sensation of surfing or skateboarding. So we have a number of really great examples, including this board from 1977, Steve Dara, who created flight snowboards, and this is a one of a kind. This is one of his earliest creations. This one actually does have metal edges if you looked at the bottom. And it has a skateboard deck, and then really rudimentary, kind of the state of the art at the time of the earliest tries of bindings. This is another bicycle inner tube. It's just, you pull it up, stick your feet underneath, and you have the staples to create some traction. Other good examples, this is one of Mike Olson's boards. Mike Olson and Pete Sari started Canoe and then Libtech in the Northwest, but you can kind of see some of that surf influence again of having fins, number of fins to try to actually create control in variable snow conditions, including more hard pack snow. So again, that DIY sort of desire to really take what you know and then really take it to the next level is really one of the foundational points that snowboarding was really built on. Skipping back to the 60s, we can't really talk about snowboarding without talking about the Snurfer. Sherm Poppin had created the Snurfer by nailing two children's skis together and giving it to his kids on Christmas morning in the early 60s so that they would not be bothering the family as they're trying to cook their Christmas meal. So he hammered it together and sent the kids out to ride in the snow, and they absolutely loved it. And Sherm decided that he thought, hey, you know what, if my kids loved it so much, we could maybe make a go of this. And so Snurfing was really the first modern mass-produced opportunity for people to stand sideways on snow. It was more of a snow toy than it was a true snowboard. But that's how it started, but then it really became a cult phenomenon with millions and millions of Snurfers selling throughout the 60s and 70s. This board is the board from early 60s, mid 60s that Sherman used to actually create his Snurfer patent. This is his daughter Wendy Poppin's board, which is just super cool. It's got her little handmade art. Snurfing became such a phenomenon that it actually as a sort of way to bring Snurfing more to the masses, they wanted to do some early contests. I mean, obviously with any sport, competing is something that you start doing as soon as you start doing it. And so the early Snurfer competitions were held at Blockhouse Hill in Muskegon, Michigan, which is where Sherman created the Snurfer. So we have some really cool artifacts here as well, including Ted Slater's 1968 World Snurfing Championship trophy and ribbon. Both ribbons. He won first place in, I believe, downhill and also in slalom. Ted's a great guy. He actually still lives in Colorado. He lives in Telluride. So, absolute legend. The other thing that really came out of Snurfing was because it was, widespread and there were millions of kids all over the place that had Snurfers. Again, how can we improve on it? And that became a theme. This board is also made by Steve Dara. So this is an earlier flight model, and it says Flight Skifer. This is a Snurfer basically made of fiberglass. Again, there are very few of these around, but it's just a really interesting way that you can kind of see where people were trying to take sort of some of the 3D sort of shaping that early Snurfers had, and actually make them a little bit more usable in all kinds of snow conditions. Snurfing obviously became a big thing. Mark and Jane Halseth, who were some of the earliest Snurfers in the country, again, trying different things. How do you keep a Snurfer on your feet? So trying early rudimentary bindings, that kind of thing. But another person that the Snurfer really influenced was a guy named Burton Carpenter. Jake showed up at the 1979 National Snurfer Contest with his own model, which is actually this board right here. If you can see that, you can see it's written. It says Custom Downhill Jake number 2. And in the picture that we're going to put up on the screen right now, you can see Jake holding this board at the 1979 contest, where he showed up, and they actually had to create an open division because the rules stated that you had to be riding a Snurfer. Again, he thought he could do better. So this particular board, handmade by Jake, actually has a PTEX base, which most boards didn't have, obviously, back then. And really trying to take some of that ski technology, some of those things he learned as a ski racer, actually at University of Colorado in Boulder, which a lot of people don't know, but Jake actually went to school there, aspiring to be a ski racer, and got in an accident, and his ski racing career was over, and he moved back to Vermont and started Burton Boards in 1977. So really interesting, but again, Jake was one of the earliest innovators, earliest pioneers, and equal to Tom Sims in so many ways as being a real influence, especially from the early days and from an East Coast perspective. I mean, people called it Burton boarding back then on the East Coast. That's how influential Jake was. And we'll talk about Jake and we'll talk about Burton a little bit more as we move along. When you really start looking at modern snowboards and you start thinking of the wider snowboard that we know now, winter stick, without question, are some of the earliest, as early as the late 60s, winter stick, and stick is sort of slang, of course, for a surfboard. So you kind of had those things two together, and with Dmitry Milovich and Wayne Stovikin started winter stick. So there's a number of really interesting examples of the earliest winter sticks in the Alfengen Museum in Utah, so it's really worth going and checking out. Also notable, shout out to Milo Sport crew. Milo Sport in Utah is still part of the Dmitry Milovich's vision of the earliest snowboard days. So it's one of the earliest snowboard shops, and maybe the earliest snowboard shop on the planet. So after the winter stick, the snowboards started getting longer, they started getting wider, and they started to be a little bit more high performance in trying to be handled in multiple snow conditions. I think the ultimate dream, of course, would be to ride them at ski areas. That was still a ways away. If you look at some of the earlier tries, there was something actually in the 70s called the ski board, which Bob Weber actually had created. And at that point, Tom Sims had seen the ski board and had ridden them, and again, trying to be very innovative. How could you take something that exists and how could you make it better? So some of these boards are things that very, very few people have seen. This was Tom's first try at improving the ski board. So the ski board is the yellow part. It was actually also called the flying yellow banana. And so Tom took these and was trying to figure out, okay, how can I make them stiffer? How can I make them better? How can I make them faster? Could I add a better binding system? That kind of thing. So Tom actually, obviously, these are milk crates that were cut apart and added to try to be to create a little bit more stiffness on the board. That led to Tom's Lonnie Toft model, which is actually the Sim ski board, called Lonnie Toft because this is actually a Lonnie Toft Pro skateboard deck. Sims was actually a big manufacturer at the time of skateboards in California. And so, again, taking his surf heritage, surf roots, and his skateboarding knowledge, and trying to kind of add those two things together. It's really funny because these, you can see where they're sort of cracked. They're famous, of course, that there was almost no stability in the nose. So the nose is breaking off. It happens all the time. So where people were actually retrofitting these even further by taking a ski and putting them up and down. In trying to make that better, Tom's next step was actually to recreate the thing in solid fiberglass. So again, one of a kind, handmade by Tom Sims, with a little bit more refined version of a binding. So just taking a rubber strap, putting both feet underneath, and hoping this would be a little bit better. This worked okay in powder, but this is the era, late 70s, early 80s, when people really wanted to start seeing what these could do. It was not a toy anymore. It was actually something that you could get more performance out of. And so the obvious next step was, okay, how do we get these working in hard pack? How can we get this at ski areas and actually make it something that was super legitimate? So that leads to a few of Tom's more experimental boards using composites or composite technologies, using epoxy and fiberglass, and again using the straps, using some, if you can see over there, some golf spikes, again to try to get that traction. We'll talk a little bit more about bindings in a little bit, but these are some early examples and some early tries to create something that was much higher performance. And that led to the Pro models, again in the 80s. This is a 150 Pro model, and that was really one of the first production boards that you could order directly from Tom Sims, and you would make them by hand in California. So those are rare, incredibly rare. They even have Tom's signature hand done on the boards. They're all hand numbered, so very few of those are around. But that was really one of the first wide production model snowboards meant to be handled in multiple varied snow conditions. So sort of going through Tom's legacy and the history there, there was a lot of innovation going really quick. And a lot of this came down, there was a famous rivalry between Burton and Sims, between Jake and Tom, which, it skipped over the line every once in a while of friendliness, but it was definitely those two pushing each other. And some of their employees as well. Tom had an early employee, Chuck Barfoot, Barfoot Snowboards, which a lot of people will know. And people started just, again, doing it themselves, taking their ideas and moving different directions. So at one point, when Chuck was working with Tom, they separated, and Chuck founded Barfoot Snowboards and really started progressing on his own side. Big moments sort of in the early Sims days. First pro model, Terry Kidwell, unbelievable snowboarder from the 80s, remains an incredible snowboarder now and a good friend. But he really, his skate roots really showed. And so this is one of the first snowboards. There had been other snowboards before that do have sort of a twin tip sort of idea with an upturned tail. But this is one of the bigger production models that was actually available in the market, and it was the first pro model snowboard. So the Terry Kidwell Roundtail was that board. And I should really mention at this point too, a number of boards in this collection, including this, were on display right now courtesy of Chris Pappas. Chris Pappas is an absolute legend in snowboarding, and a lot of us, including myself, really wouldn't be where we are without people like Chris again, taking snowboarding, making it their own, and then taking that passion and making sure that everybody sort of followed in their footsteps. So big shout out to Chris Pappas if you're watching right now. So the Terry Kidwell Roundtail, the 1500, the FE series, the fiberglass epoxy series, became a hugely successful early snowboard that actually, we started seeing metal edges and those kinds of things. And that's when the bindings also, and we'll talk about bindings in a minute, but bindings went from rudimentary strap systems to actual bindings that you could secure your feet to a board. So we'll talk about that. The other thing that's really interesting, and Sims, again, innovation was Tom's thing, but the women's side of snowboarding really wasn't women. There were a lot of women snowboarding, but they were all riding the same things. And while there was maybe one snowboarder, the Petra Musig and Lisa Vinciguerra pro model and Checker Pig that was available in Europe, the Sims Shannon Dunn pro model, and Shannon she's actually in the Hall of Fame here at the museum, and she was one of the earliest, along with Tina Basic and girls that were riding at the time. Super influential, really pushed not only the equipment side of things, but also the apparel side of things. And so Shannon had the first women's pro model, and really the first broadly distributed actually snowboard of any type that was designed specifically for women. So around the same time period of sort of the early 80s, snowboarding really did start to become, more prevalent. People started to see it. That's when I saw it. And that's when I was able to actually get on a snowboard super early on. But with that, of course, came sort of that exposure and that need for exposure, especially with early snowboarders, early technologies. There was nothing really talking about that. There were some early mentions. Action Now magazine, which will pop the little cover on the screen right now. That was December 1981, which was definitely one of the earlier cover shots. Action Now was a magazine that Skateboarder magazine actually created to be more of a less skateboard specific, but really action sports in general. So it was skateboarding and BMX and things like that, and then snowboarding. So some really good early coverage there. From a true media perspective, the earliest one, and this photo is what got me the most excited about snowboarding early on. Steve Caballero, who's a pro skateboarder, early Bones Brigade, of course, we all know who Steve is. But just seeing some of the stuff he was doing, there's actually an early sequence in this magazine that was from 1982 out of California. So this was really the first snowboard-specific magazine that we know of. And, it had ads, it was full coverage of snowboarding, and it didn't go too far. And this is not the same as the later snowboarder magazine, of course, that we know now. But this was the earliest snowboard magazine that was really kind of a standalone, besides like Snurfing News and a few things that people did on the Snurfer side. That then changed in 1985. So 1985 was a big year for snowboarding globally, and it was one of the big breakthroughs, to be quite honest. Absolutely Radical. So Tom Shea created Absolutely Radical magazine. This is his actual personal copy. You can see his red line notes of the changes he wanted to make before this was released. So it's a newspaper format, of course. I think it was $1, 75 cents, even better. So this existed as Absolutely Radical for one issue. Then they changed it. Tom decided that nobody again with that hope of getting onto ski slopes, because there were very few places allowing at that time. He kind of thought that there was nobody who owned a ski area who wanted things that were absolutely radical on their slopes. So they changed the name to International Snowboard Magazine, so ISM. So really, Absolutely Radical Volume 2, this is really it. This is what it turned into, and this became I think they called it the first mag, the last word, I think was their tagline for ISM for a number of years. And that's where we got all of our early information. But when you talk about global exposure, and this photo right here you might recognize, this is Tom Sims in A View to a Kill in the James Bond movie in 1985, where James Bond was getting chased through the mountains and pulled a skid off of a helicopter, threw it on his feet, and then started snowboarding down the mountain. And it was Tom Sims and Steve Link who did all the footage, which sort of culminated in one of the best pond skims of all time. If you guys remember that movie, it's worth checking out on YouTube, at least the snowboarding part. But this is one of the snowboards that was actually in that movie. So obviously painted to be just like the board. It's missing the sort of helicopter skids that were kind of attached to it. You can kind of see some of the holes. But that was really pivotal. And again, this was a big deal for snowboarding globally and exposed countless people all over the world to snowboarding, which also was happening at the time in Europe as well. We won't talk about that as much here, but there's some really, Regis Roland and some of the Apocalypse, some of the earliest snowboarding of that era was also being done in Europe at the same time. So it was really a global phenomenon. So obviously, we've talked about Jake Burton and his importance in snowboarding. Unfortunately, we lost Jake last year. He was really, not only one of the earliest pioneers, but he was one of the people who really brought snowboarding to where it is. Obviously, Burton's the world's largest snowboard-specific, snowboarding company, and well-deserved in so many ways. They were pioneering not only, of course, in the equipment, but in ski area acceptance, in technology, if there were any first that Tom Sims and Jake weren't head and head, Jake probably came up with a lot of those first as well. So anyway, you've got to really credit Jake. This is one of his earliest prototypes from 1977. Again, you saw his early custom downhill board that he had shown up at the Snurfer championships on. But he was also interested in surf construction. So this is done with a foam core with a fiberglass wrap. In a surf style construction. He did move back and really go down the wood route, I think for a number of reasons. I think an ease of construction, and also it was definitely an accepted type of construction from the skateboard world. He still, coming again directly from sort of his snurfing roots, the nose rope was a big part of it. He also had, at that point he was a little bit probably ahead. Late 90s, and sort of the way he was doing bindings, sort of taking some water ski style bindings, and trying to really again bring more control. We also have in the exhibit the actual molding block. If you come here, it's actually down here. It's a little bit harder to see, but we do have some of the earliest pieces of equipment to actually make those early snowboards. These are known typically as Londonderry boards, or the BB1. These were made in Londonderry, Vermont, where he had his first shop, and then Manchester after that, and then Burlington, and it remains in Burlington today. Again, that need to really innovate, to really have the performance, and with that goal of riding ski areas. That was the goal for so many of these people, especially Tom, Jake, anybody who was really thinking that this could be a future, not only for them, but also for their business. That would be the big breakthrough. So this snowboard here, this powder gun, is David Alden's, and it was actually handed directly to David from Jake. And this is the earliest known Burton with a metal edge. So you can't see it here, but it actually has it was routed out and it was added, metal edge was added to it. Where Sims had Terry Kidwell, Sean Palmer, some of those unbelievable early innovators, of course Shannon Dunn. Burton was really put on the map, not just from some of the earlier riders there, but really Craig Kelly. Anybody who knows anything about snowboard history, of course, knows the name Craig Kelly. He actually was an early Sims rider, and then transferred over to Burton, which caused a big lawsuit and all kinds of things between Burton and Vision Sports, who at the time owned the Sims trademark. And Craig he had to ride for an entire season on a blacktop snowboard that had a black bottom with no branding. Once that was all settled, Craig was able to actually put his name on snowboards. This is the Mystery Air. So this is a 1988 model. It was really the 1988-89 season, and this was a pretty big breakthrough in ski construction technology. Sidewalls, where a lot of the earlier Sims boards were made horizontal laminate. similar to a skateboard. This was really taking a true ski style construction with sidewalls, edges, of course, P-Tex, and then also the integrated stance, a little bit more side cut, really meant to perform on ski areas. Craig's riding style, of course, I mean, he was such an early innovator in freestyle. This board, because it was made during the end of the lawsuit, this is Craig's personal board. You can see it actually has his name on it. I think there's 2 or 3 of these in the world that have his actual name screen printed on the board. But the way you know this is Craig's board as well is that it actually has only his stance in the board. So it was handmade personally for Craig. Unfortunately, Craig, after his world championships and all of the things that he had done in snowboarding, especially on the freestyle side, he really fell in love with backcountry snowboarding, of course, and powder and the roots and the surf style that he was really known for. I mean, he was like the smoothest guy on a snowboard. So he actually really retired from competitive snowboarding and decided to pursue big mountain free riding, and was really an early pioneer in big mountain riding, including he became a guide, and he was really devoted just to the backcountry. He was guiding a group in 2003, and unfortunately an avalanche broke above him, he and his group, and this is actually the split board Craig was riding, or actually skinning up at the time. So you can see the left ski is actually broken, so this was generously put on display from Brian Kelly, from Craig's brother. But again, if you have if you're ever around and you really need a snowboard pilgrimage, come and see. You can really get a feel for Craig just by standing here. It's a pretty powerful moment for me. But it was a big loss for snowboarding. I mean, some of the losses, of course, Craig was the big one. Tom Sims, we lost a couple of years ago. And again, like I said, Jake Burton passed away last year. So great guys, knew them all personally, worked with them all personally, and just really appreciate them and everything that they've done for snowboarding. So specifically in Colorado, I mean, obviously Colorado is sort of the midpoint of the country, and was really pivotal, obviously, in the early years of snowboarding. There were a few Colorado manufacturers early on at the same, in the same era, that were really interesting. There was a company, Bill O'Connell and Kerry Campbell, along with a guy named Scott Dowell, Skosh as he was known, actually started making snowboards in Littleton, Colorado, and Denver in 1974, which is also a very sort of little-known story. But they started making snowboards. They were riding at Loveland Pass, Berthoud Pass, St. Mary's Glacier, all over the place, and quit making snowboards because they moved to California and tried there. It was just too early, and there was just not a big adoption of snowboarding with what they were able to do at the time. I mean, again, there was no internet, there was no real way for people, unless you saw somebody out on a mountain somewhere, to really even know what snowboarding was. And in early 70s, there were no ski areas here that were really allowing snowboards on the mountain, or if they were so small that they didn't get a lot of exposure. But if you move forward into some of the later era, Swift, so the Canaday brothers, Tim and Tracy Canaday started a company called Swift, which has evolved now into Never Summer, and so they're still hand making snowboards in Denver, and they're one of the the world's largest snowboard makers now as well. And those guys are crushing it with Never Summer, and that is just one of those brands that has just really remained and is steadfast in the snowboard industry. Mike Trotman and Butch Bendeley were doing UCB. So they were actually kids. They were 16-year-olds, and they were in Lakewood here in Colorado. Started making UCB, which stood for Ultimate Control Boards, in 1981. And they were trying to make things out of UHMW polyethylene instead of it in wood and sort of skateboard construction that other people were doing. Also, of course, everybody making their own bindings. These are old Lang ski boot buckle. This is just, again, some more of that same polyethylene material and just some Fastex clips and buckles. Steve Link was actually very well known in Colorado. Of course, we've talked about Steve, and he's another one of those pioneers, another one of those sort of 6 degrees of Tom Sims. Steve is one of those guys. And he started a company called Summit Snowboards in Summit County, Colorado, in Silverthorne, and did a number of, unbelievable boards that he was such a great innovator, and again, part of that whole DIY sort of mentality. And there were plenty of other brands in Colorado. We'll talk about some of those, the biggies that come to mind in those early days. Of course, Aggression is one of the bigger snowboard companies that made a big change. We'll talk about them a little later, as well as Naked Snowboards, and they're so many people making their own things, again, trying to make snowboarding their own. Snowboarding, of course, we talk snowboards all the time, but boots and bindings also had their own evolutions and were really pivotal in snowboarding going to really where it has gone today. So from a boot perspective, this is the boot that so many of us, this was it. Sorel Caribous, that was the boot for early snowboarding. Not much support, and they were warm, they were available, they weren't super expensive. And you could wear them sort of all day, every day, and then you could snowboard in them too. So, anybody who started snowboarding early on, that's probably the boot. Then it sort of evolved. This is actually a Scott Downey Pro model. So Sorel actually made this boot back early in the day. But the boot that really sort of defined snowboarding and really took it to the next level was the Burton Freestyle. So anybody who rode this, you'll know. They made a two-tongue version where they put a tongue on each side so you can tweak them better. But this boot in particular is something that really led to all of those early snowboard boot brands. I mean, Airwalk was also a mainstay at the time. But this is really kind of the boot of reference at that time. So with the boots, of course, you've got to have the bindings. So bindings have really evolved over time as well. So Sims had an early tray binding that had just a Fastex clip. And so it held your foot to the board pretty well. Burton had very similar items that did some ratchets or Fastex. But the big breakthrough there, of course, was the high back. There were a lot of people actually wanting that same sort of support so you could make better heel side turns with different variations early on. But the most well-known, of course, Louis Fournier, known as Lofo, creating high backs in the early 80s. This is from 1984. This is one of his first. And Louis was really the first one credited with doing a fold-down high back. And then also Jeff Grell was doing something that he actually named the high back. He was in Aspen at the time in the early 80s as well. That was something you actually would strap to your leg, and it would go along with your leg, and then you'd step into the vine, and it would give you that same heel side support. From a commercial standpoint, that led into the early Sims high back binding. You can actually see in this picture here, where it was actually a production model taking the earlier base tray and then adding the fold down high back and the ski boot bales. So that was something that really, again, you put the snowboard technology with the side cut and the edges together with the boots, and then you also would put together the high back technology, and that was really, you put those three things together and you have what's really essentially a modern snowboard today, because you could actually ride a lot of these boards, and I've ridden actually most of these boards personally over the years, and you can actually carve them almost as well as you can carve a modern snowboard if you just do it the right way. So it's really interesting that feeling, especially carving on hardpack snow, is actually very similar if you're riding a Kidwell roundtail as it is to sort of a modern twin tip. When you're looking at, again, those innovations, this is Tom Sims' first board that actually had a true binding. So this is, again, the precursor to his tray binding, but again, super interesting because this was sort of his evolution. You can see this board actually this is the piece here and there where you'd actually hold that rubber strap and put your feet underneath. So this board, he actually took the rubber strap off and then hand forged just bent some metal with some clips and tried to make a truly modern snowboard binding. That led to And again, you can see in this is one of Tom's boards where he was working on insert patterns. So this is the one where he figured out the 5-hole pattern for his boards. Again, one of Tom's boards, all of his hand drawings, all of the just the engineering that he was doing was really wild. And it was interesting back then too. If you wanted to do something innovative, you had to do it. You had to literally build it by hand. You would have to go out and actually ride it and test it. And so that's just, again, kind of a testament to how hard it was back then to actually get those innovations to sort of take, because you wouldn't have just one season. It would take multiple seasons sometimes to be able to get the time in on the different variations. But Tom was really one of the ultimate innovators when it came to snowboards. The other thing that's really interesting, and so SnowTech is a brand. Ernie DeLost and Doug Baxendahl created the SnowTech brand. They were in New Jersey at the time. Again, early innovators, and responsible for they have one early twin tip, earlier than anything that I've ever seen, in the early 80s. With maybe not so much a twin tip, but with a raised tail, so you could ride it backwards. But the interesting thing about this snowboard, it actually has a slider system. So again, how do you adjust your stance? How do you, can you adjust it for different snow conditions, for different stance widths? So this is very similar to what Burton has now in their EST system. But you can see, again, ideas have been around. People have been trying since the beginning of snowboarding to really dial it in for a specific rider, for their own preferences and their style of riding and their conditions. So again, without a lot of the work that Ernie had done back in those days, they really moved snowboarding forward very quickly in a very short period of time. Now that we have the board, we have the bindings, we have the boots, now it was time to open up ski areas the best we all could. So it was really sort of a effort of not only manufacturers, of course, Sims and Burton, but also riders themselves. So there were a number of, it took forever. It took forever, especially for the bigger resorts to allow it. There were so many ski areas, and I can't even, there's no point in even saying who was first, because there were a lot of little mom and pop ski areas that never didn't allow snowboarding. But the major resorts were the ones that were kind of the big prize in the eyes of most manufacturers, because again, if they could get the bigger ski areas to accept snowboarding, then they would be able to actually, obviously, have more riders, sell more boards, and really grow snowboarding to what we all knew it could become. So early groups of riders, of course, were the drivers, the early brands, Tom Sims and Jake Burton, of course. But one of the bigger things that helped was even David Alden and the Alden family, Paul Alden, were super instrumental in getting the insurance companies to actually certify snowboarding under the skiing insurance policy. Without that happening, it would have been very difficult for those bigger resorts to ever allow snowboarding. So that was a huge breakthrough, and there were a lot of people, of course, that were involved in that. And also, David is also, he co-wrote the first PSIA, Professional Ski Instructors of America, manual on teaching snowboarding. So those are the things, and while we're out there wanting to snowboard and doing all this crazy stuff, there's so much that had to be done behind the scenes. And then it became time, year after year, another area would kind of open up. And then the big breakthrough in a lot of people's eyes is Breckenridge allowing snowboarding in the mid-'80s. And so we'll talk about that when we talk about contests a little bit. But they're still, here's an ALTA rejection letter that Mike Trotman got in '96 saying that, I think it says, "We wish you a great snow surfing and hope you are ever in the area. You will stop by and keep us posted on your progress." So there's progress. You still can't snowboard at ALTA. So moving into the '90s, things were really interesting back then. The '80s were a time of real sort of, exploration and innovation, technology. how could you make snowboards better? So as we talked about a little bit before, obviously snowboarding and competition is sort of the natural progression of anything. People want to see who's the best. And skipping back past the World Snurfing Championships and that kind of thing that ended, true modern snowboard competitions really can be traced back again to Colorado and to 1981 at the King of the Mountain contest at Cooper Hill, which is Ski Cooper here in Colorado, which is actually really interesting because Ski Cooper is actually right next to Camp Hale and is some of the same terrain where the 10th Mountain Division ski troopers of World War II trained back in the day. And part of our mission here at the museum, of course, snowboarding is the thing that I've been paying attention to the most or most contributing to. But as Jen said in the beginning, there's the whole ski side. But we also have a really interesting exhibit on 10th Mountain Division and their contribution not only to the world in helping secure the victory in World War II, but a lot of those guys returned back to the U.S. and started the modern ski industry here in the U.S., whether they were founding brands or founding ski areas, or even Bill Bowerman from Nike was 10th Mountain. So the legacy of the 10th Mountain Division really can't be overstated, and it's just really interesting that there was so much history around the birth of the industry with Camp Hale and the 10th Mountain Division. And just so happened the first modern snowboard contest was also at the same place. So birth of that also then came full circle to the birth of snowboarding. So King of the Mountain, which was organized by Richard Christensen, that had a shop in Boulder on the hill called Pacific Shore. And he had been hearing about snowboarding and people were coming in and he wanted to have a contest. So again, Ski Cooper, 1981, and really, again, talking about Colorado as sort of that middle point. Tom Sims came out, Jake Burton came out, Scott Jacobson and the crew from Winterstick came, Jack Smith with A-Team came out from California. So many people came and converged in Colorado for this truly first snowboard contest, and it was Tom Sims versus Jake Burton. Scott Jacobson ended up taking overall. Tom Sims took slalom, second overall, and Jake Burton came in second in slalom and third overall. So that was, again, a really pivotal moment. As Richard Christensen told me, there were no ski areas that wanted to allow this, but he actually had the management from Ski Cooper, who were customers of his at the shop, so he gave them a call, and they welcomed it with open arms, and glad they did. So some really great footage available, obviously, straight from Richard, from firstonboard, I think, .com. So you can get sort of that, I think it's called Snowboarding's Holy Grail, but it's a really good DVD, but it's also, you can get it, I think, in digital format. Super interesting, so it's all the earliest guys talking about their boards that they brought to the contest, Tom and Jake explaining their boards, and then it's got some really interesting early footage. That led to contests regionally. The National Snowboard Championships in Bromley in Vermont was something that Jake and Burton put on early on in 1982. Tom Sims did the same thing in California in the early 80s. And those were sort of those early regional contests. But what really, and actually I should show you this. This is one of Tom Sims' original trophies. So in those early contests, Tom always would say if you could beat him to the bottom, or if you could beat him, he'd give you a snowboard. He usually won. He was actually a really, really good snowboarder at the same. Interesting thing about this was first place downhill from the National Snow Surfing Championships in 1982. If you can see the guy on the snowboard, they didn't have snowboards back then. They didn't have snowboard trophies. So this is actually a tennis player. You can kind of see where they broke off the tennis racket. Just the way they make the trophies, he's kind of standing on a plank, so he looks like a snowboarder. So all the early snowboard trophies were tennis trophies. They broke the tennis racket off, so that's really pretty cool. But again, I talked about the World Snowboard Classic, and so this was in Breckenridge. held in 1986. And this was such a breakthrough. This was snowboarding competition on a global stage. Again, organized with Fran Richards, who's very well known in the snowboard industry, and David Alden, Alden family. And this was the first major ski area to hold a truly global event. It had a lot of, it was really interesting, it was really fun, and it was the place where all of the early snowboard manufacturers would really show up and show what they were working on. Whether it was Sims, whether it was Burton, Barfoot, GNU, Mike Olson and Pete Sari, again, everybody came, everybody converged, people in Colorado making snowboards. That became really the sort of mecca of early snowboarding. And with that global stature at a major ski resort. So we can't really say enough how important that was and pivotal to showing the snowboarding was actually something that ski areas could not only get away with, but actually thrive with. And the images and video of those early contests went all around the world. Riders came in from all over the world, and it became that catalyst for a number of bigger ski areas to really follow suit. Back then, it wasn't like it is now, where there's a few different players that own a ton of ski areas. Every ski area was independently owned, and they were all hyper competitive. So people would try to start one-upping each other, and it's sort of that one-upping where certain things like terrain parks, half pipes, those kinds of things started to also evolve at the same pace as the rest of it. And it was really, kind of talking again about those early contests. They were hand-dug pipes. They had some ski things. There was still slalom, there was giant slalom, there was downhill, there were bumps contests. So they were really interesting, but it was always the half-pipe comp that was the really interesting thing. And half-pipe is a relative term. We literally went up with shovels, some backhoes, and hand-shoveled, hand-dug those pipes. And here's a photo of the 1986 Worlds at Breckenridge. So just to give you a little background on my own personal history in snowboarding, I grew up in Boulder in Colorado, part of sort of an outdoor family, and fell in love with skiing super early on. My dad was a big skier, and so that was just kind of the thing I lived for. And then a little bit later, late 70s, mid to late 70s, found skateboarding, and that was my thing. All kids sort of rebel against their parents. I rebelled, and skateboarding was the thing I did. Back in those days, in Colorado especially, before they were putting chemicals on the roads to melt ice, that kind of thing, they put rocks, they put gravel. So even, Colorado gets 300 days of sunshine a year, a lot of good skateboarding days. Every sidewalk, every road, from the first snowfall until they came and cleaned it all up in the spring, was covered in rocks for the most part. So being so into skateboarding, I was able to be exposed to snowboarding at a really early age. Some of those magazines, the things I've showed you, were things that I actually held in my hands and found early, especially the Stevie Caballero stuff in the early 80s. But I was involved really early in snowboarding. I was really lucky to be one of the handful of snowboarders in Boulder, and there were not that many actually in Colorado. And I got involved with the industry side really early. There was a place in Boulder called Bob's Toys and Hobbies, and there were only a couple places you could buy snowboards. Actually, buy skateboards. That was one of them. And then they started carrying snowboards. Met a guy there named Fran Richards, which again, he's a pretty famous guy in the snowboard and skate industry. And just started to realize you could actually maybe do some of this stuff for a living. I started working at a shop called Wave Rave, which there's still a Wave Rave. The original one was in Boulder in Colorado. Brett Conrad and Sandy White had started that. And I ended up getting a job there in junior high in 1984, 85, right around there, selling skateboards. And we also had, my brother and I and a few other people had kind of talked them into carrying snowboards. So I was really lucky. I've been really lucky because I was exposed to some of the earliest snowboarding, some of the earliest snowboard industry. I got to meet and start knowing most of the guys, and that's why we had some, these connections with David Alden and Curto and myself. We've all been in it. We're kind of lifers. So we were lucky enough to be right place, right time, have people like, Chris Pappas and Steve Link to kind of lead our way and make those sort of introductions and really show us what can be done on a snowboard. And so I was selling snowboards in the early 80s and kind of never looked back. In the Wave Rave actually started a clothing division that was really one of the earlier pure snowboard apparel companies. So I was able to be there and help with the design and really starting that whole part of that business, which was super cool. Brett's brother, actually, Chip Wilson, had West Beach in Canada, and Chip is famous because he started Lululemon. So again, snowboarders being creative and innovative really take things to a bigger level. Rick Alden, who started Skull Candy and is a big partner in Stance, also was a co-worker at Wave Rave, as was Fran Richards, and just so many sort of early people in that industry. And so again, most of these boards actually, if you're talking early 80s, mid 80s, all the way through, I actually not only did I get to ride them, but I got to sell them as well, and I got to rent them to a lot of people who would come in the shop. My own sort of, when I kind of went out on my own, I went out with my brother and a high school friend, Amani King. We were at Boulder High at the time, working at Wave Rave, and snowboarding had kind of gone a direction we didn't necessarily love. It had gone, things were actually kind of, they're good now, but then everything had gone neon, and it was really a lot of ski discipline, it felt like, and racing and that kind of thing. And snowboarding just wasn't what our roots were. Our roots were purely in skateboarding. So in the late 80s, we started a company called Twist, which was one of the earlier new school companies, where we were, again, just a bunch of kids who didn't like where snowboarding was going, so we decided we would take it into our own hands and sort of make it our own. So we started making clothes, and we'd cut them on our ping pong table in the basement, and my mom would sew them together. And one of the earliest hoodies that my mom actually sewed the patch on herself, we started a clothing company, and when you could actually create clothing in Colorado, we were actually cutting and sewing apparel in Boulder, actually. So through that, Twist became sort of early and innovative, and again, that skateboard style snowboarding that we really wanted to do. I had mentioned Aggression, Matt Nipper and Aggression earlier, and Boulder company that was really early in the innovation of snowboards. You can see this is a 170. So Tarquin Robbins, who was a rider out of, who was living in Boulder, a really good friend of mine at the time, and still a good friend, had a pro model. And this was a freestyle snowboard, believe it or not. So snowboards that, back then, 165 was kind of the standard small length. 170s, 180s. They actually had a TR85 model, so a 185 model planned for the next season. So this is sort of that 91, 92 season. What really happened at that time, riders started kind of converging again on Colorado. A lot of guys coming out of the Midwest, guys like Jay Nelson, Nate Cole, Dale Rayberg, Rowan Rogers. There were a number of people, Tarquin Robbins, of course, from Colorado, Quinn Sandvold, Todd Richards was here, Adam Merriman out of Boulder, who really converged on Summit County and really ushered in the whole new school movement. And that's really much more of what you see snowboarding is today. Problem was the equipment. And again, big, giant snowboards were very hard, especially with the evolving sort of things that we were doing, riding rails, jibbing, all the stuff that everybody does now. There were no snowboard parks, and we were just doing it on the streets, or we were doing it in places we probably weren't supposed to be doing it. But again, the equipment kind of held everybody back. So again, is sort of if there's one theme in all of this, it's that sort of DIY mentality, and it's in taking what you love and making it better. So all of the early riders, especially the Summit County New School movement, started cutting their tips and tails down on their snowboards, because you just didn't need this much, and people weren't riding as much powder. They were really exploring what they could do on logs and on handrails and more urban kind of riding as well. And here's a really good example of why you don't need so much nose on your snowboard. So you can see why you'd want to maybe have a little less nose and tail. So jigsaw, snowboard. So you literally just go, use a paper plate as a template. This doesn't have a blade in it right now, but you literally just cut off the tip and tail. And all of a sudden you've got a 150 or 155 from a 170. So that's when people refer to cut down snowboards, that's what they're talking about. And that was, again, another big it was just such a hugely influential thing. And so much of that, again, just came out of people wanting to do their own thing in Summit County, Colorado. So if you look at this board, the TR55, this is the next season's board, where it went from, that to that. So that's Tarquin Robbins' pro model from that year, which is the famous, maybe not be able to see it. It's tied up. It's the shotgun base. So anybody who knows this board, this is one of the most coveted boards in the collector's circles these days. Really interesting too. I mean, again, there was no internet, so all the way up until this point, I mean, there was still no way for people to really talk, except for through their own peer groups, their own groups. The New School thing, the Summit County thing, was really kind of exciting, and it felt like it was snowboarding back in the day, and it was new, and everybody was really progressing at a super high rate. But again, we were doing our own thing, and so there was no real way that bigger magazines or media were really covering what we were doing. So again, pre-internet, we had to sort of do it ourselves. So we were doing things back then because we were really into, it was really skate driven by mentality, where art and music and culture and lifestyle was really a big part of it. So we were making our own videos. This was something called Anthem that really kind of is one of those videos of the day, along with like Hungry and Homeless and a few other videos that were around back then, that we made out of Boulder, out of the Twist office, with Justin Hostenek, who you may know because Vertical Addictions, his early company we were doing with the Twist videos, turned into Absinthe Films, which is still the world's largest snowboard specific media and video company going. So if you like Absinthe, you can go back. I think you can probably find Anthem online or on the Absinthe website and really see where some of that came from. Again, trying to recreate what became sort of the internet. We were making calendars. So snowboard calendars. The big magazines weren't covering what we were doing, so we started Crucial Leisure. And again, talking about sort of new school snowboarding and what we were doing, because the racing thing and snowboarding and ASIM boards and all that stuff was still really prevalent. There's Dale Rayberg on the back. That was Brett Johnson on the cover. But mainstream media weren't covering these kinds of things, so we really just had to do it ourselves. We even made audio cassettes to try to get the music in there. Dubbed a bunch of those, sent those out. And even back then, this is one of the Twist catalogs. This is from our fourth year. This was like 1994. So again, just kind of showing how important art was to the process. We didn't have any photos. We couldn't afford them. But Evan Hecox, who was one of our partners at the time, who went on to be pretty world famous as one of the Beautiful Losers, and has done collaborations with Nike and Adidas and all kinds of big brands over the years, was part of that sort of initial Twist crew. And again, we were trying to take everything that we were doing and really get that out to kids all over the place. So again, really great time in snowboarding, and really led to, I think, in so many ways, what modern snowboarding sort of is now. And a lot of, there were some early brands at the time. Joyride, of course, was a big one. Here in Colorado, Solid Snowboards, who were making snowboards in Fairplay. Kurt Wastel and Jeff Wastel and that crew, Neil Rankin. Really influential early brand in Colorado. And that's also the same time when Tim Pogue started Ride Snowboards. Ride is, again, one of the bigger brands today. Back then, it was just his, sort of brainchild, and became the precursor in so many ways to what maybe Forum or a brand like that would have become after that. So again, pivotal 90s, skate style snowboarding, new school movement, and so much of that can really be traced right back here to Colorado, Summit County, and then it kind of moved to Vail, and then from there Utah, and it just really went all over the world. Southern California, of course, and really became what snowboarding is now. Around today, but most of the sort of spectator favorites still comes back to big air and half pipe and more freestyle side of things. And it wasn't really that great back then. I mean, the contests were amazing, the energy was amazing, but a lot of the time, riders, when they weren't competing, would build better hits, quarter pipes, all kinds of things off to the side, and some of the better sessions would actually go down to the side of the half pipes and not in them. That all changed in the 90s when a guy out of actually Boulder County, Doug Waugh, was a farmer and decided he could build a better half pipe. So he created the Pipe Dragon. This is one of the first sort of schematic drawings of what he actually went on and created. And Doug just had this vision to create the true real half pipe, and used his farming knowledge and the knowledge of the sort of farming equipment, and decided to create the Pipe Dragon. And really what the Pipe Dragon did, it opened up the world of sort of that made-for-TV kind of snowboarding, where it was really, you were able to capture it in a very small area, and then the progress of riders and how they were riding and the tricks and everything that they were doing just really went big. And then, of course, became a real way for big-time exposure, which led to, obviously, there was X Games, which was a big early driver. U.S. Open, of course, which actually is happening here now in Vail every year, and that also led up to the Olympics, which people have their opinions whether those types of things are good for snowboarding or not good for snowboarding. I think the net gain of acceptance of the ability to really see what can be done. I mean, it's really blown a lot of people away, and it's probably been one of the major factors in sort of the major rise in acceptance of snowboarding, and also in building terrain parks and those technologies, those things that you do, really then work their way back into skiing. So twin tip skis, again, terrain parks, the real freestyle aspects of sort of the modern free ski movement really can be traced back, obviously, to snowboarding. Probably wouldn't be the same thing without a snowboarder. So either you're welcome or we're sorry. I don't know which way to put it. The rise of contest snowboarding actually was really great too, because it was an equalizer in so many ways with exposure for women's side of snowboarding. When you can see what's going on now, how just crazy the level of riding is now, and I think those are things that you just wouldn't have ever been able to sort of even kind of dream about. But again, going back to Shannon Dunn, Megan Pischke, Barrett Christie, I mean, Tina Bassich, again, those are names that are just sort of should be well known throughout snowboarding, because those are the women that really took it to that level and showed the world what could be done. We kind of end, at least at the exhibit, if you kind of think of the first real bookend of snowboarding, the Nagano Olympics in 1998, really, that you can go all the way through the history, and that's really what has led now to the mainstreaming of snowboarding, and that, again, that global acceptance, and now it's really obviously a real industry. And that really is where we kind of ended this exhibit. I mean, of course, there's so much snowboarding after that, but Shannon Dunn was the first woman or actually the first Olympic medalist from the U.S. Who won bronze medal, which was incredible. And Ross Powers actually won medals as well in the same Olympics. And again, sort of legendary riders, Todd Richards, number of people competed back then, and those early teams and the U.S. dominance in snowboarding has continued a lot to this day. Of course, I mean, the Shaun Whites of the world and all those names, Danny Cass. I mean, there's so many names that probably without the that connection back to even the Pipe Dragon and to the sort of made-for-TV sort of snowboarding, they just wouldn't be household names like they are now. And so that's kind of where we end. There's been a lot that has progressed since then. My personal favorite stuff, and actually it's hard to see over here, but split boarding. If you see the Never Summer Swift split board on the wall, the shape revolution that's going on right now, you can see so many of these shapes are actually being remade now in the market because there's so many fun shapes besides just twin tips that the world is sort of known for in snowboarding. And that's it's a wide open frontier again right now. There are lots of really great little snowboard makers, sort of boutique makers who make them by hand again. So again, snowboarding, the best thing about snowboarding is that it's always been in the hand of the riders. And it's always been the riders themselves that have progressed it. It's never just the big companies that can do it. It's people just like you probably watching who love snowboarding and want to make it sort of your own. And if there's anything that we can do with this exhibit specifically, it's hopefully give you a little inspiration that, just do it. Nobody's going to tell you not to. If you want to do something and you think you have an idea, just do it. That's how everything in this room and actually how snowboarding has come together from day one.